Welcome to this episode of Slugger TV. Normally during the summer we take ourselves off down to Armagh to the John Hewitt International Arts Festival, and we go live for once in front of a studio audience with a panel. Now this year, due to coronavirus, Armagh is out and the live audience is out, but I'm really glad that we've got a great panel along to discuss our topic: after lockdown, can the arts return to health without a vaccine? And so I'm really glad to be able to welcome today Roisín McDonough, who's the Chief Executive of the Arts Council in Northern Ireland, Maureen Kenelly, who's the Director of Chomhairle Ealai, the Arts Council of Ireland. Mary Nagele is there from Arts and Business NI, and John Campbell, who's the BBC Northern Ireland's Economics and Business Editor. Thank you very much for coming. We're recording a little bit ahead of when you'll be seeing it, so just kind of bear that in mind in case coronavirus moves fairly quickly these days. But as before we dare to look post-lockdown, maybe there are a few things that we should kind of get your opinion on to set the scene. And I suppose the first one might be to say, was the arts sector in particularly rude health before lockdown, before COVID came along, and before the ramifications of what happened? Roisín, maybe go to you first with what was the state and the health of the arts sector?
Well, I think it was in a very fragile and perilous state in many ways, due to a whole series of circumstances, but principally because of the lack of funding over more than a decade. I mean, we lost around 40% of our income. We get round about £11 million from the government to fund the arts sector here in Northern Ireland, and obviously we have some lottery funds, but all the other UK arts councils have similar. So if you think, our nearest comparator is with Wales, and Wales with a comparable population gets 31 million while we get just under 11. So that will give you a sense of the state of the sector. The other thing that I would say is, whilst the sector and those who work in it form part of a very, I would use the word fragile ecosystem, and whilst they bring great joy and pleasure and entertain us and all of those things that are very important and enlighten us in many ways, actually the mental health and well-being of those who work in the sector is very, very challenging. They're 3 times more likely to be depressed and have suicidal thoughts. So it's a side of the sector that we don't, I think, in a wider society fully comprehend, because we know the arts bring enhanced emotional health and well-being to many, but that is at great expense to people who are, by and large, often very poor, who are in precarious employment, and who rely, who are freelancers basically, or self-employed. And we've seen the horrendous effect of that due to the COVID situation. So in a precarious state before we even entered this pandemic.
And Maureen, south of the border, I see lots of festivals, kind of Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway and so on. I see lots of small companies and larger companies doing great work. I see venues that are putting on lots of things. But is that a sign of, just because people are busy, is that a sign that the industry in a sense was in a good place and was growing in the way that they would want to grow?
It was certainly better than recent years, but just like what Roisín has said, we described it as the underlying condition of the arts, so that when COVID hit, it was particularly hard hit. And then of the people-orientated industry where, you need to be in contact with people to make work, and also then obviously to present and to deliver work, it's especially acute. So the common refrain has been, it was the first to shut down and it'll be the last to return. And that's obviously a global phenomenon. And then added to that, of course, is the freelance nature of it. So you have a situation whereby we have this quite good core infrastructure which supports key organisations, festivals, art centres and so on. But then, just like Roisín said, you have this enormous freelance sector, and they are, and their portfolio career is built on any number of gigs. They're very much emblematic of the gig economy. So when COVID hit in March, they would have been looking forward to a season ahead of gigs in festivals primarily. It was really coming into the boom period. So for them, it was a particular shock. And just underlying too that emotional and mental health aspect is really important, because it is a sector which is characterised by poor levels of income, And again, like Roisin said, that dimension of depression is there a lot, because, you have people who are working at a very high level, at a very intense level, the kind of high wire act of presenting art. So then when things become unsettled and unseated, the shock can be even more acute, and you always just worry about that sense of isolation for those freelancers and people who particularly thrive on working together. So that would be a big concern of ours. But on the other hand, on a more positive front, you do see that people are reviving and trying to do as much as they can. Digital is not the answer, as we all know. It can never be a replacement for the live thing, but people are being remarkably imaginative and innovative in their approach. And one of the things that we did in the first instance before I took on my role here was to make 90% of funding available to organisations and art centres immediately, so that they didn't have that worry of how will we survive to the end of the year. So since that time, we've just been building on that, and be happy to talk about that more.
Yeah, we'll kind of maybe come back on to a little bit of the impact of COVID on the sector and what it's done in between. Mary, your organisation, maybe you need to kind of explain, to remind people kind of just a little of what it does. But in some ways, it's there not only because there's value to business in working with the arts, but also because the arts community doesn't, in a sense, needs extra help and is keen to work with other people and also access other funds, frankly, sometimes. And business is one place for that to come. So in a sense, is your organisation kind of a cost of failure that you have to be here because there isn't enough in terms of kind of ticket income and kind of grant income, or is it actually a real bonus to have that kind of engagement with the business as well?
Yeah, well, for people that don't know arts and business, we support the sector, as you say, in trying to have a more diverse income model. And just to support what Maureen and Roisin have said, really pre-COVID, the sector in terms of the income model was in a very financially fragile state. And I think that scenario whereby you've had 1 year funding and compounded public funding cuts has made long-term strategic fundraising really, really difficult. So the sector absolutely is already diversifying their income, and we support them to really look at a suite of funding or a cocktail of funding from lots of different sources. But the harsh reality is, if you have 1 year funding and you have compounded cuts where you've lost staff, I mean, most of these organisations are small to medium sized companies. They don't have fundraising staff. So I think that's the real challenge. There are amazing opportunities for income growth, particularly from the private sector, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later. What we are hearing all the time from the private sector companies that we work with is that they want to positively define Northern Ireland through a vibrant arts and cultural sector, and that makes a really positive statement that encourages investment, making Northern Ireland a place that people want to work, live and invest. But actually also from a business perspective, the arts have a really credible offer in terms of helping businesses with their challenges around people engagement or engaging with communities. But the bottom line is you have to look at a suite of funding, and the challenge is that with that precarious foundation, it's very, very difficult. And what we have seen is the sector really pre-COVID was hollowed out. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good place to start before a global pandemic hits.
John, in terms of the foundation of funding from, if you like, the state that was around for arts, the last figures that I saw kind of came through Fact Check NI, when they kind of looked at the comparison kind of across England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland per head. And if you take kind of the kind of grant and aid money, and you take kind of national lottery money, which effectively is kind of similar, Northern Ireland comes out about £6 and 6p a couple of years ago per head, whereas Wales is there at £13.29, so it's kind of double. Is that and those kind of the numbers from Northern Ireland have obviously gone down with the cuts in years? Is that kind of typical of Northern Ireland in the sense that we value certain things and we don't value others? That we even had a department for culture, arts and leisure, but then it became subsumed within the kind of monstrous department for communities, which deals with housing and historic environment and urban regeneration and benefits as well. So is in a sense, is it a Cinderella sector?
Oh yeah, well, austerity has been real, as we've heard. 10 years really of real terms funding cuts. We've just seen within the last year or so, some organisations completely defunded and organisations effectively disappeared. I think when we look at the engagement with the arts, though, so there's good data which the department produces, the continuous household survey, and it has actually been pretty steady since 2010 right through to the present day. You get about 80% of people surveyed engage with the arts in some way during the year. About a third of people actually participate. You can see, about 10% of people play a musical instrument for their own pleasure. 5% partake in photography for artistic reasons. So the levels of engagement have held up despite what have been really serious cuts in funding. I think the point you make about the department is a good one, where you had this focus. You had an actual department for culture, arts and leisure, which is now gone, subsumed. Also, just frankly, the arts sector does not have very much political power. It does not have very much lobbying muscle. It's very diffuse with a whole lot of different people doing a whole lot of different things. So I know efforts were made. When you look at some of the work that, say, Arts Matters did in terms of actually getting organisations to stump up to actually fight a lobbying campaign. But it's just impossible to sustain that because there is frankly not the money or the focus to do that. So when you don't have political power and resources are scarce, you're going to lose out. And frankly, that is what has happened. And I think one of the other big difficulties when the pandemic hit is that the sector was told you need to be less reliant on grants, you need to be more commercial, and you need to get more of your money from commercial activities. But those organisations which have done that and have been less reliant on grant funding have actually probably found themselves in a worse position at the pandemic because all that money, all that revenue disappeared overnight. And as we sit here today, has not in any way really been replaced. Whereas if you were more reliant on grant funding, you at least probably had a bit more of a cushion. And then the structure of the sector as well, just at an individual level, has caused enormous personal hardships for people because, as we've heard, that it is non-traditional employment models. You don't have that many people who are in full-time salaried work in the arts. It's project to project, it's freelance, it's casual, and it's precisely those sorts of people who have fallen through the gaps in the various funding schemes which the government have brought forward to try to support people.
Because I suppose from a UK point of view, the Chancellor had a furlough scheme. So if you were kind of a full-time employee, then that was an option for people. There was a freelance scheme through HMRC, but you had to have at least 50% of your income coming from freelance. And I guess there were people in the arts who seemed to be kind of in a mix between you would go on payroll for a couple of months for a project and then you'd come back off again, and they kind of fell between the stools. There are presumably other sectors as well where this happens, but is arts the main one? Is this the main kind of hole that you detect?
Yeah, I think it's hard to think of another industry where you have such a kind of array of employment types, and there's such casualisation, and there's such short contract to contract working. Now there's certainly lots of other sectors where there is lots of non-traditional casualised employment, be it social care, be it hospitality, but I don't think there is another sector which has more diversity in terms of the way people were employed. And so it was very difficult for, if you like, the kind of big machine of government to react to all those different types of employment at such short notice. Now, some people who are self-employed and have, a self-employment history, they may have been kind of helped out pretty well through the self-employment grants, which allow people to actually claim that grant, but also to continue working. But it's tend to be those people who, like you say, have had a range of different employment types, have been on contract, have been employees, have been self-employed, who have probably found this period incredibly difficult.
And Maureen, there's probably a day in February or early March when you kind of realised that this year was going to be rather different, and that actually your ability to fund things had changed. How did the Arts Council of Ireland kind of adapt to kind of coping with what was a kind of a strange and emerging situation? Even now, we're still not really quite sure what the end game is. So what were some of the things you were able to kind of to do to change to flex in order to kind of help?
Flex is the key to it. Just to say that I wasn't in my role back then. I started my role on April 14th. So, and I was due to start on Tuesday, May 5th, but I just started a few weeks early because of the situation. So when COVID hit, I was back in my role as the Director of Poetry Ireland. But the Arts Council moved quickly, as I said before, to make that advance of 90% available to organisations, and very much encourage organisations to prioritise artists in dispersing those funds. And just in February this year, the Arts Council launched its Pay the Artist policy. So it was very committed in saying to organisations, you've got to follow this policy, because being aware that this freelance sector was going to be so badly affected. So saying to organisations, even if you haven't contracted artists, in the next few months, please make good your commitments to them, because they're the ones who are going to be hardest hit in all this. Since that time, then, it's a process of gathering data, doing surveys with organisations and individual artists and arts workers to see what has the actual impact been on them. So we spent a lot of April doing that, gathering that information, helping that to advise the government then to say, this is how bad it is and this is what's needed. And we brought together an advisory group at the very beginning of May. And from their meetings, which they met about 6 times, and we produced a report called Survive, Adapt, Renew, which is about saying to government, these are the supports that are needed. And very fortunately, the government listened. So they made more or less the sum of money that we said we needed in terms of supporting and sustaining the structure just for this year. So that was 20 million more or less. Mm-hmm. And that came through, which was terrific news. But of course, we're trying to look forward as well, and against the backdrop of an ever-changing situation, as we all know. And we have set out that we need 30 million, so 110 million for next year. And when you look ahead, that's to say, okay, we hope that, say, come summer next year, that people are going to be back into some sort of normal activity, but they're going to need more money to produce the work, and then they're going to need vastly increased sums as well in terms of persuading the public to come back to events. It's probably a worldwide phenomenon that audiences tend to be older for some events, particularly classical music. So, they're going to be naturally hesitant about coming back. So in terms of rebuilding that public trust, it's going to be a huge part of what organisations are going to need to do. So we want to support them to do that.
Roisín, I'm not sure whether you're jealous. I can't quite tell over video conferencing in terms of whether you're jealous of a €100 million kind of budget for Arts Council Ireland. But in terms of what you were able to kind of do with the kind of wide range of artists and kind of parts of the sector, what were you able to do? And I suppose how receptive were your political masters above when you kind of said, by the way, we do need more money, and we're not just begging for it, but it's required in order to sustain the industry?
Well, like Maureen, we were able to give out 50% rather of our funding in one go. Government was advising 25%, but we put out 50% immediately. And we repurposed a little bit of our lottery money because, for example, there was no international touring or work or travel or anything. So we repurposed some of our lottery funds and opened up an artists emergency programme, which gave people up to £5,000 if they could demonstrate they could complete some piece of work by the end of March next year. And we were very light touch on that because we recognised that obviously people can't work immediately under crisis circumstances and produce something, but we needed to invest in their time and their thinking and their research, and recognise that developing projects is actually really, really important to buy the artist time to do that. So that was oversubscribed 3-1. We just didn't have enough money. And we also have opened up an organisations emergency programme. The department gave us £1 million, and the organisations emergency programme is giving people up to £25,000 if they can demonstrate that they need that and that their loss of income as a consequence of COVID, over and above the grant that we give them, because we know that people are hemorrhaging more money all the time. And we're very concerned that coming towards the end, or the gradual reduction of the furloughing scheme, we know that the sector faces the potential for redundancies there. And the other dimension I would like to add is that our sector probably only has about, our funded sector that we support in Northern Ireland, probably only has about just over 1,000 full-time equivalents in it, though there's about 7,500 people who work in it. But the critical thing is that it has over 4,500 volunteers who support it. This sector, our sector, would not survive without volunteers. And regrettably, the profile of volunteers in our sector is older people. So even when it does reopen, we will have this additional problem of transitioning into a situation where you're unlikely to have the same level of volunteers that you have used in the past to sustain your operation, to put on your performances, to run your venues, to act as, front of house or whatever role they may play. So in terms of receptiveness, we described our sector to the committee for the Department for Communities, and we told them, because we knew we'd run surveys on the impact of the sector, catastrophic loss of income, £25 million of box office income wiped out completely just overnight. We knew that even in the first couple of months of the pandemic, those artists, those freelancers, those creative practitioners, they lost almost £4,000 of income immediately. And indeed, the possibility, and we talked about the gig economy, that many of those people who were in between jobs would have actually worked maybe in bars to supplement their income. And that was all wiped out as well. So it was truly catastrophic for people. The committee were very receptive to what it is we had to say. They recognised the value of the arts. And that's become something that has been foregrounded far more in the course of this pandemic. The number of people that you meet who have said they've tuned in either digitally or reading more or are watching more arts on television. And they have turned to the arts because the arts provide that level of uplift, some solace, some entertainment, some enjoyment that we all need when we are hurting very badly in the course of the pandemic. And everybody recognises that. So in a sense, it's been a paradox. The very place that people have not valued, which has been the arts up until now, is the very place that they've turned to in the midst of a crisis. And our artists have really risen to that challenge extraordinarily well in spite of the pandemic.
There was much excitement early in July, Roisín, when we kind of heard the news that in England there was going to be kind of a big investment had finally been kind of announced for kind of arts and wider cultural kind of things, and the Barnett consequential, which is something which John probably often talks about when he's on air, kind of means that about an extra 33 million will end up in the coffers of the Northern Ireland Executive. However, it's up to the Executive how they would want to spend that extra money, there's kind of a moral, maybe ethical case that says that actually that most of that money should actually go towards similar things to England. Do you have a hope and an expectation or a fear around whether that money will arrive and what you'll be able to do with it?
Well, I think you're right when you say that there is almost a moral imperative that lies behind that announcement, that it would be a travesty if in Northern Ireland the money for the purpose which it was allocated in England was not broadly kept in terms of what it was required for in Northern Ireland. Now, we know that a portion of that money will be in the form of loans, and that's obviously to help people who are working perhaps in the live entertainment industry, that element of the business. It also is going to cover museums and heritage as well as the arts. So you can already see that, given the footprint for which the money was earmarked, at least, and hopefully will be delivered, has some kind of caveats around it. But certainly our expectation would be that it should help with organisations and individuals as they move out of furloughing It should help with the minimisation of redundancies that the sector will face. It should also help to get audiences back again and get them confident about returning. But that will all need to be underwritten, because you cannot operate at a social distance within a theatre, the Grand Opera House or the Lyric, at probably more than 30% capacity. So somebody's going to have to underwrite that risk for you, and we believe that money should be used for those purposes. And indeed, we know that many local authorities have their venues have been closed as well, and they need to be reopened and audience confidence rebuilt to return to places where the arts are made and seen and presented. So we believe that a significant proportion of that money should go to the arts to cover a lot of the issues that the sector is facing. And most importantly of all, if that is the case, we need to move in the future to a sustainable situation for the arts, whereby this is not just a one-off big bang in the midst of a pandemic. We'll sort people out for a short period of time, because remember, this money has to be spent within the course of the current financial year. And then come the 1st of April 2021, we're back to the same position that we were prior to the pandemic. And Maureen is quite right. We will probably not see the resumption of work in venues to the degree that there was previously way into next year. And in the meantime, we also know that work needs to be created for when the venues are fully reopened, and investment in terms of commissioning and in the work of artists and valuing our artists and their contribution and what it is they create also needs to be urgently addressed in terms of this package of funding.
There was an interesting article, I think it was Gemma Tipton was kind of writing in the Weekend Irish Times recently, and she talked about specifically about theatre, but she said it was broken before COVID and there's no going back. And John, some parts of the industry, some parts of the sector are very much kind of based around kind of panto at Christmas and various things that happen kind of seasonally, kind of bring a lot of people in, and then that money kind of subsidises costs over the rest of the year. That sounds a bit like the tourist industry though as well, who often kind of make hay while the sun shines in the summer months, and then small B&Bs and things kind of nearly shut down and people do renovations and things during the winter. There are other sectors that are seasonal, but I guess kind of Gemma's argument is that just the way that the finance happens, and I guess even if we extend it slightly, the reliance on the state or other people, or the ability for people not to be able to pay enough to sustain work without intervention, that makes a very kind of unsustainable business model.
I don't see how, while social distancing continues, that the theatre is financially viable, or even viable as a form you might want to go and see. Because what is the experience like of a theatre which is a third full? It's not a great experience. I've ever been to productions which haven't sold very well. And my understanding of the economics of theatre is basically most productions need to hit 60% capacity to break even, and depending on how elaborate your production is, you may be getting towards 70 or 80%. But as Roisín was saying, at 1 metre social distancing, it's 30%. So you're having to ask government, while social distancing continues, to basically underwrite half your costs before you even break even. So that's the economics of it. But then, how enjoyable is that experience of sitting in a sparse amphitheatre? There are certain things you can maybe look at, like you can have some outdoor theatre, but how viable is that more than about 2 months of the year? And then also you talk about panto, which for some venues is the big money spinner. But panto is likely to be, if you like, the riskiest sort of theatre, because it's full of people shouting and laughing and singing along, and we're told that those are the riskiest activities. So I have to say, personally, I'm extremely pessimistic about what theatre can actually do in particular, and also gigs, while we have social distancing. I just don't see how they are a viable form at this time.
Mm-hmm. Mary, maybe kind of moving on a wee bit, but what are we at risk of losing in all of this? What is it that we need to save as we go forward? Because the sector is much loved by some, but it's also much ridiculed by others who say, build hospitals, close theatres, close art galleries, we don't need them. So what is it that we we're going to lose if we don't wise up?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that live, you can't beat that magic of live performance and theatre and, gigs, all of those things about bringing people together, and it's the interaction between the audience and the performers. But I actually think the biggest concern would be the loss of talent. So I think that's our current creative talent. So absolutely, as it's been mentioned, that what's been really highlighted is the vulnerability of freelancers and creative professionals, and it's really raised questions about how they're valued, as a profession. So I think there are already fears and stories of people leaving the industry. I personally, as somebody that has had the joy of working in this sector all my career and working with amazing people in my current role and in other roles who are truly passionate about what they do, I also fear about the future and people entering our sector. So in a post-COVID world, ensuring we're supporting entry paths for, creatives into our sector. I actually fear also, thinking about, one bigger point about, the economy. When you look at the importance of creative skills, it's bigger than just our industry. So the World Economic Forum cited creativity as number 3 in the top skills that are needed for industry in 2022. So investment in our sector is going to be absolutely critical to economic and social recovery, but it's going to be critical to the industrial strategy, our economic recovery. And my plea to government would be, doors have been opened and I think we're being heard and valued to be more than before, but let's keep those doors open and let's have, look at the arts through a much bigger lens, which is much more longer term and sustainable. And so that would be my fear of what's being lost, really.
Maureen or Roisín, if talent is the thing that we could really lose, that talent, I mean, I can see that if you're a kind of a fine artist or something, you could be sitting painting away at the moment and in splendid isolation, and that might still work, though you may not have the same kind of ability to actually sell your product at the end. If you're a dancer, you probably have real trouble actually rehearsing with other people who are outside your bubble. You certainly you need an audience for that kind of thing often. If you're the guy who sets the lights in a theatre, you're probably in a 0 hours contract and nobody's going to hire you for the next year. So there's a whole range of people, some of whom can work, some of whom will struggle to work, and some of whom may not be around and will have found other jobs if they can, or moved on to other things. So how do we try and help those who are kind of really going to struggle to be helped by venues not opening quickly, or by some of the schemes that kind of just they fall out of the edges of?
Again, it's investment. We need to make sure that we can hang on to as many of them as possible, because they have very specialist, very high level skills, and exactly like you say, lighting designers, technicians and so on, whose work has been desperately obliterated. How do we make sure for the next year or two that we can keep them within the industry? So we just have to invest in them in terms of financial support, obviously, and in terms of professional training that we can encourage them to do with our support. So something that we'll be rolling out now shortly is a capacity development program, whereby we're encouraging people to look at business planning, their own professional development, the digital world, just to say, okay, this is going to be a reality, just not to say it's the panacea for all ills, obviously, but to say that, there's going to have to be a mix of this, both in terms of actual presentation and the dissemination of work. So how can we upskill people so that they retain their interest and they see that there's financial investment in them for the next couple of years, in order that when we come out of this, which it will end, we don't know when, unfortunately, that we have a really vibrant sector, and that we don't lose too many people, but inevitably we are going to lose it. You can imagine if you were a 16 or 17-year-old thinking about a career in dance, it mightn't look like such an attractive prospect right now, and so we've just got to try and make some supports available so that people stick with us.
Mm-hmm.
I think Maureen's absolutely right. One of our great concerns would be the pipeline of talent, as it's called, might actually be cut off as a result of people saying this is not a sector that I can consider working in, given its precariousness and given the current situation. So I really do think we have to look at the talented 16 and 17-year-olds and try and support them financially to get into the wonderful courses that are there in universities and further and higher education, and not to discount that possibility, but to think more to the future by supporting them with bursaries and things like that. I also think there's a cohort of people, younger people, whose dreams must be in shreds at the moment, who are coming out of maybe art college or drama college or whatever it is, or further and higher education courses, who will be looking for work and just there isn't anything there for them. So I think we have to actually support those people financially to bridge into the future, rather than simply say, well, they're not really part of the sector at the moment, and therefore we can't, we can't support them. I think we have to have a much broader view of the talent and the creativity of our young people through to bridging them over the next few years to be able to upskill and to retain faith that there will be work for them. And I just think that is so essential. And we know that young people in particular have been very badly hit by this pandemic, with real mental health problems and issues which are going to be apparent. I think as we ease our way out of lockdown further, but I would definitely make a plea that we consider that serious investment in the creative talent of our young people, which we will need in the next 3 to 5 and 10 years, and we need to invest in that now.
Wearing a different hat, I've been kind of producing some podcasts with the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, kind of looking at, they're kind of looking at lockdown like many organisations are, and kind of looking at what lessons there are to be learned and what people are kind of doing along the way and the variety of things. And I suppose the summary of it would probably be that it'd be sinful if the churches went back to exactly the way they were in February at some point in the future, because they need to change and they have learned things from this. So I'm kind of wondering, as a sector, what the arts community has learned from this period of rather enforced reflection and maybe stagnation. But what are the things that need to be different as it comes out of lockdown, but also hopefully in a year or two when things are happier? So I'm thinking maybe things like digital, people have experimented with, they know some of the good things and the bad things about it. Audience expectations may have changed quite a bit. People's comfort levels of large crowds may have changed as well, which may really hurt gigs and those kind of more standing kind of things. So I'm kind of wondering, what are some of the lessons that you think we're starting to learn, or that we should be at least kind of tossing around and thinking about as a sector?
Well, I think, we've already referenced the digital potential, and there's no doubt that people will need to be skilled up for that, and they'll need to have investment, not just in the skills, but also the technology and the wherewithal. Now, that can be done. And there is an increasing evidence to show that people are willing to pay for digital, maybe not the same extent as a ticket to go to a concert or to the theatre, but there is growing evidence that people will pay some money for that. So I think it's just understanding audience dynamics and interests. So that would be really important, because we know that audience behaviours have fundamentally altered and will not remain the same for some time. The second thing I would say is very interesting to me when you see some of our local community-based arts organisations who absolutely know who their audiences are and how connective they have been in terms of this pandemic with the local groups and the types of activities with which they have engaged. And they have shifted their model a little bit. They're doing some stuff at social distancing outdoors. They are bringing arts to people's homes, literally to people's homes, and into care homes and outside of hospitals. So it is possible that those models of engagement, whilst they will not be in the traditional way in which we have hitherto perhaps experienced the arts, nonetheless, I think in Northern Ireland we have a great wealth of experience about how communities are adapting and are resilient, and the arts sector is absolutely known for that ability. And we've had some fantastic examples of artists and arts organisations just doing precisely that, bringing the arts to where people are in smaller bites, as well as I said, moving to online platforms. So it's going to be quite different. I think, the 1,000-seat at the Grand Opera House to see the Panto is really not, as we've said, feasible under the current circumstances. But yet, there are things that organisations such as the Lyric have done with their fantastic series of bite-sized pieces in conjunction with BBC Northern Ireland, which then went to BBC 4 as well. A little 5-minute pieces of plays commissioned from very talented writers and with wonderful actors, showing the effects on people of lockdown, which was really successful. There's been some great work online. It's not the panacea, as Maureen has said, but it is an element.
And Maureen, I think we saw the Abbey did something similar kind of near the beginning of lockdown in terms of little kind of 5-minute pieces with lots of different kind of writers and artists and things kind of being brought together. And that works for some art forms and it doesn't work for others. But maybe you want to share some of the learning that we can get kind of across the island.
Sure. I mean, I think agility is the key, and that we need in the Arts Council to be more agile ourselves in terms of responding. That's a big lesson for us to have learned too. It's certainly not business as usual, and that we have to respond to people, to organisations and individual art workers and individual artists in an entirely new way, because their needs are evolving, and that's a big lesson for us to have learned. But in terms of the audience, then we conducted some audience research as part of our advisory group report, and it showed encouragingly that 59% of people said that they would pay for digital events. So, that's certainly an encouraging start, and we'll be going back to do more research in September, October, just to take the temperature then. And at the risk of sounding partisan, but because it is the Hewitt Summer School, I wanted to mention what Poetry Ireland had been doing, and Elizabeth Moen, with the terrific team there, had come up with this lovely idea of a poetry line whereby poets would ring people who are self-isolating at home, particularly older people, and read them reassuring poems, which would, hopefully give them some comfort. And there's been a massive response to that. And that's something that Poetry Ireland is continuing and working, in fact, with Ace Donna here as part of the Arts Council to continue that and to expand it. So, it is about how organisations have been extraordinarily inventive and adapting to the changing circumstances. Again, that's a small example, but it's an indication of how people have to change their thinking in the absence of being able to deliver events in the normal way.
John and Mary, some of those examples that we've heard have been agile and kind of flexing ways of working. They're not terribly sustainable in terms of financially. So the business model of care homes paying for artists doing stuff in their car park is minimal. Generally, somebody's going to have to sponsor that or make that happen. Poets, I'm glad they were optimistic poems and things that were being shared. I had visions of what the kind of poetry and short stories I think we'll be reading in the next couple of years will be pretty dark. But those are good things, but it requires some kind of infrastructure. In a sense, do we need to kind of rethink that the value of the arts? We should need to stop thinking financially, John, that actually, although that's how politicians and civil servants make decisions based on value, based on impact, and it tends to be about money, but actually that's the wrong dimensions to be, the wrong measures to be using.
Yeah, so just before I come on to that, I'd say that I'm not terribly optimistic that we learned very much or grew very much in terms of lockdown, because I have not seen a great deal of evidence that there's been much new in terms of form or content or technique. As an example of lockdown, I just think it was pretty much a negative experience. Monologues or two-handers are as old as the theatre itself, So, I suppose we're grouping for a silver lining. I frankly don't see one there. Digital is, I just think, bad. I would much rather the five of us were sitting around in Armagh having this conversation rather than doing it via Zoom. So I'm glad to hear that poetry line sounds good, but on the whole, I just don't think we've learned very much.
We'll get you an invite to one of Big Telly's next Zoom theater things, because it will blow your mind what you could do with this form. But it's still very different from theatre and
But in terms of that wider point about the applying value and economic value to the arts, I'm kind of have a real aversion to trying to apply economic value to the arts. I think it was a bad and dangerous path that the sector had to get forced down, where you have to say we are receiving public money, therefore we must demonstrate that we are growing the economy. So you get these slightly sketchy impact assessments which make all sorts of heroic assumptions about the economic value of your work, which I think is dangerous, because on the kind of most optimistic readings of what does the creative arts add in pure GVA, gross value added, similar to GDP, it's only about 3%. So of course it creates jobs and people work in it, but I don't think that's where the value of the arts lie, and I think it has been dangerous to go down that path. The model I would prefer to look at is to look at the kind of stuff Richard Florida has talked about in The Rise of the Creative Class, where you say, if you want to have a vibrant city economy, which is full of young people doing exciting things in technology and the creative industries and other things, you must have a vibrant art scene. So you've got a good cafe culture, you've got places for all these young people to go to and thrive. And so the arts is part of that. And so you kind of should create this kind of virtuous circle where you have arts, you attract sort of people who work in those high growth industries. They then are an audience to grow that sector more. So it's more like you use the arts as a way to kind of induce this rise of the creative class. So rather than trying to apply individual impact studies to individual organizations or productions, is a bit of a fool's errand in comparison. Now I know that Richard Florida model is much criticized now as a kind of basically just a high priest of gentrification. But I still think it has some value and is better than the alternative of these slightly hokey impact assessments, which people are forced to do.
Mary, the arts are looking for something out of business, and the business are looking something out of arts. Is that going to be a good relationship going forward? Are there ways that both can serve each other in wholesome ways?
Yes, music to my ears hearing John say that not everything that counts can be counted. So I think we're going to adopt you as our business champion for the arts. So thank you for that. I think in terms of the relationships moving forward, businesses are going to support exactly that message about investment in the broader value of the arts. I think obviously cash has always been difficult. We have to remember that our private sector here are made up of SMEs. So really what was the old sponsorship model has moved on to much more kind of multi-layered ways of working in terms of partnerships between businesses and the arts. Yes, businesses are giving their time to join arts boards, and I think that's going to continue to be increasingly important. We have a fabulous programme, the Arts Council Fund Young Professionals on Arts Boards, which any business people want to join, that's a great way of doing so. And actually, to mention the John Hewitt Society, Ryan Cornett, he's a graduate of that programme, is on their board, works for Investec, and I know he's got as much out of that experience as he has given to the John Hewitt Society. So in a post-COVID world, exchange of skills and time is an absolute important way. Yes, those kind of cash partnerships are still going to be important, but I think in the short term, it's going to be challenging for the sector, because anybody that knows anything about strategic fundraising knows that takes time and investment. So, just to reiterate the points that I've made before about invest in the sector and allow it to grow, I think there are opportunities that many organisations are already availing of around, for example, the employee wellbeing piece. That's important to business at the moment. That was important before COVID. And there were business partnerships such as Tinderbox with City whereby they are working with City on a whole mental wellbeing programme based on theatre-based techniques. You have Bounce Culture working with accountant speaker Tilly Mooney on attracting talent through a podcast series. So wellbeing in the workplace is going to be even more important post-COVID. There are opportunities for the sector to step forward, maybe, and take an asset like a skill and make money from that. But they're absolutely not going to be able to do that without changing their business model and investment. So in terms of being real, that point about investment in let the sector to survive, and then investment for the future in terms of being sustainable in a much more longer term way, and then that is going to reap benefits for the economy and, you know, our education and our health and well-being.
I was just going to say the other thing that I think probably there's been a degree of reflection across these islands is about who's actually accessing the arts, and in an increasingly diverse society, which I think all of us would welcome. That growing diversity, which is we can see in Northern Ireland, are the arts and cultural expression of those communities being supported to flourish and to promote a greater sense of interculturalism as society is changing. As I've said, I think all of the arts councils on these islands have reflected, particularly in the context of not just the pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter campaign. There are very profound issues in terms of who accesses the arts. And I think we are well versed in that in terms of Northern Ireland. And it's something that we've been encouraging our arts organisations for quite some time, is to think about the diversity on their boards, to think about what kind of product is being, what kind of performances, what kind of work is being staged, and to look at their audiences and to say, who are these audiences? Can we collectively be doing more? So I think that is a moment for reflection as well, because we can't continue to reproduce the same audiences for the same products and performances that we had before we entered this pandemic. And I think the artists and arts organisations are very adept at holding a mirror up to society and showing a pathway forward in terms of those types of engagements with a more diverse community. And I think we've got some terrific examples and organisations that do that in Northern Ireland, but we need to invest in them more. And the final thing I would say is there have been so many victims, not just victims of the Troubles, and there are very many of those, but victims who are really hurting in terms of grieving because they weren't able to have contact with their loved ones before they died. And there are people who are victims of abuse. We are a society which is very badly hurting. And for me, I think the powerful role that the arts can play in terms of helping articulate the experiences that those people have had and engaging with them to move forward is going to be critical. And I think, you know, when we think about the health service, we say it's free at the point of delivery, and rightly so, in my view. We should also be thinking about arts being free at the point of delivery as another essential service, a service to the wider civic society and our democracy and all of us as human beings.
Our kind of, suppose our challenge today was to kind of think about, after lockdown, can the arts return to health without a vaccine? I'm not sure actually whether it's possible without a real vaccine for us to come up with any alternatives. But I suppose I do want to ask in terms of just to maybe to dampen the mood or maybe to lighten it, who knows, in terms of when do you think we will see some kind of big venues and also some smaller community venues actually hosting things that people think of as kind of as live theatre or as kind of live music and so on? Do you have any kind of feeling in your bones when that will be possible?
I don't think it'll be until next year.
I know that, just back to John's point about the one-person shows, that Fishamble Theatre Company are going out with Pat Kinnavan's show before, which has been much seen across the island, I think, and that's happening in August at the Theatre Royal. So that's the first event that I'm aware of, and I just heard this morning about a very good Irish language theatre company for young audiences called Meban in Connemara, and that they're doing some drive-in theatre in Connemara next month, I think it is. So, you know, there are some things happening. But yeah, in terms of that greater collective, more than the one person show, I think it's, you know, late spring, summer. But of course, you know, we're all guessing at this stage, aren't we?
Yeah,
you know,
completely.
in a way. I would love to circle back maybe to Roisin's point about the equality and diversity piece, because that's something that's very much to the front of our minds as well, that, you know, we're completely aware that there's a whole cohort of the population that has been left outside in terms of before COVID, you know, and it's something that we're working on very hard here ourselves in terms of the equality, human rights and diversity piece. And we just simply do not want people who were left behind to be even further back in the queue now in terms of their access to the arts. So it's absolutely incumbent on us to make sure that they're not. So we're going to really focus on that area in the coming 6 months to a year.
John, you haven't had a great artistic cultural experience during lockdown, but we will give you some pointers for kind of some good things here. I think for me, probably having spent far too long in front of video conferencing in the last few months, what Big Telly were able to pull off in terms of immersive theatre, in terms of actually keeping an audience engaged, knowing that we were all there watching, but also having performers in different places, lots of green screen, lots of kind of quite interesting use of layers and things. They actually pulled off, I think it was kind of Operation Elsewhere and the Machine Stops was their second one. It was quite remarkable what you could do with the form. Now, I'm not sure they'll switch to doing that full time for the rest of their lives, but actually, in the meantime, it was quite original, and it certainly the Zoom wizards in behind the scenes who are actually making it happen. It was kind of quite spectacular. It was certainly good afternoon's entertainment, and it would be well worth paying for. I think as an experience, certainly a one-off or a two-off. But looking across Maureen and Mary and Rushing, anything that John's missed out on that he should have been at?
Yeah, I think there's been so many. I mean, it's been really spoilt for choice, actually. So, I mean, we were lucky. I was delighted to be able to take the investment programme that the Arts Council fund us and refigure that to help some organisations and freelancers produce. It was a seed fund to help them to produce remote engagement products, which businesses have been using, maybe to help employees working from home or people that have been on furlough. And I personally enjoyed a few of those myself. So one of those was Tinderbox Theatre Company designed a rejuvenating soundscape called Repose. And it actually took you through 5 different landscapes. And where I live, I wasn't able to get to the sea, you know, for coastal walks. I really missed that during lockdown. So just being able to listen to that soundscape and be on a beach. And actually another one, Maiden Voyage, did a fabulous dance space piece, you know, so that's about movement and, you know, correct posture, working from home. So some of those, obviously the lyric as well. I mean, there's so many. I also loved what the Golden Thread did with their curator, where they had artists talking about maybe archive. So we'll send you a few links, John. But yeah, I think the blended approach to the future about live and digital is important. I know Big Telly has spoken about actually the international partnerships alliances that have really come from that. But I've also heard people think about that piece about digital exclusion and people in rural areas. Some venues be lovely things about just picking up the phone and talking to audiences, you know. So I think a blended approach is the way to go in the future. But yeah, I've enjoyed a lot of the content that's been out there, but I'm missing live.
One that I'd like to mention is Irish National Opera, and it's ongoing these few weeks. It's bite-sized parts of Mozart's Il Seraglio, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It started last week. And just the inventiveness that they've brought to it. And you're watching it, looking at these classical musicians playing extraordinarily well and just going, how in God's name are they doing that? It's phenomenal. And I also wanted to mention Stephen Sexton, who is, as you'll know, is one of our super bright stars in the poetry scene. So he gave a really lovely reading and chat back near the very start of the crisis, and just very simply produced, no bells or whistles, but you know, poetry is one of those art forms that's easier to transmit, obviously, in digital ways. So that was pretty special too.
You reminded me of the Ulster Orchestra. Some of their players are obviously trapped at home. If you look up Richard, their viola player, did a kind of a trio with himself, and it's remarkable. You rarely hear a viola solo, but you rarely hear three of them working together. And it was you kind of went, oh, actually, an orchestra is really interesting. Even when you kind of decompose it to one player, you can still actually do quite fun things. But anyway, Roisín, you must have some things that you've enjoyed.
I'm glad you mentioned the orchestra, which are doing that. And they're very, they're very adaptive and very resilient. I don't know if anybody heard NI Opera do at home for Heroes the Gala concert, which was great. It had Jeannie and Jimmy Galway on it, had Barry Douglas, had the priests. So celebration of all that the health service has endured. And supported people throughout. The other thing that I really did enjoy, now we're going to the BBC National here, was Michael Sheen and David Tennant with a guest appearance by Dame Judi Dench. And that was absolutely hilarious. Two actors whose West End play had to be postponed because of COVID. And this new director was trying to persuade them to rehearse online. Well, it was truly, really hilarious. And
W1A reaches the theatre, basically. Yeah.
Judi Dench gave them both a kick up the ass, as they say, and there was some bad language involved too, but it was terrific. So there are things. And the final thing to say for me is that, NVTV, there's a slot, I think it's maybe every Friday, that one of our staff members do, John Campbell, which tells you what's on this week. So it's a kind of preview of what's happening. So John, if you needed to reference in a very easy way a menu of options for you, there you have one ready made with NVTV.
I wouldn't like you to think that I consumed no culture during lockdown at all. I very much enjoyed Grayson's Art Club on Channel 4, yes. Grayson Perry, which was a superb show and was one where the element of the Zoom calls did actually work. I thought it was a very humane, touching show in many ways. I also, I think probably like a lot of people, I was going on lots of long walks during your state mandated one bit of exercise during the day. So listening to lots of radio and really enjoying the documentary on One archive from RTE. Some amazing work there, which is basically, decades of work from RTE. Some great art documentaries like Summer of Astral Weeks about Van Morrison in the period before he recorded Astral Weeks, which is a fascinating piece of work. And he tracked down the session musicians that Van Morrison worked with, and it gave a great insight into session life, because one of the players, he had to record a Pringles commercial in the morning and then record Astral Weeks in the afternoon. So that was his life. And then the last one, I think I listened in darker moments to, there's an artist called Callie Malone, who does kind of like minimalist drone organ pieces. They're quite dark and introspective. So just a little bit of that, but not too much.
I fear we probably unfairly characterised you there and picked on you, John. But can I thank the panel? Can I thank Roisín and Maureen, Mary and John for your input today? We could talk for much longer in a sense, but I think maybe we'll come back to this in 6 months' time and kind of see how the sector has changed, how lockdown and our health has changed, and also where we are kind of financially with organisations and with people's well-being in the sector. Slugger TV will be back next month, and hopefully we'll see you in Armagh next year. Thank you very much.